share his knowledge, and those of you that have read his books, that's awesome. It's great. So here's the man of the hour, Bryan Post.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for coming out. Glad to be here in Calgary, Canada. This is beautiful. I love Canada. It's a beautiful country. My first experience with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder was when I was in Head Start. And so that puts me at about 5 years old. We had a young man there. He was on the spectrum and he was Fragile X, so he was pretty severe. That was my first real experience. And my second experience was when I was a 21-year-old social worker working at a residential facility. I placed a young man who was FASD as well as autistic. My third experience, which brings me full circle, was here in Canada. I worked at a residential facility in British Columbia, Vancouver, and we had 5 children in a group home placement, and all 5 of those were FASD children. So I've had some experience along the lines of my 20 years. Now in the US, we don't do a lot of FASD as a primary diagnosis. There's lots of it as probably a secondary diagnosis, but not so much as a primary diagnosis. So this evening what I hope to do, and we only have 2 hours, so I've got 20 years to put into you guys in 2 hours worth of time. What I hope to do is to give you a different understanding of some of the challenges you've been facing when you look at your children, what you see in them, and that's really been my whole platform pretty much for my entire career. And I've taught this message around the world, and so I hope to give you just a different lens to look through when it comes to looking at your children. So let's go ahead and dig in. I'm going to ask you this question first and foremost. What is FASD? Now you can tell me it's fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, right? Well, that's the definition. That's how it's defined. But what is it? What is it really? Because I think this can help all of you. FASD is trauma. That's what you need to understand. FASD is a byproduct of a traumatic experience. And so this evening, we're going to talk about trauma, because that's really what you have to understand about the children that you're working with. All of your children that you're raising have experienced trauma. Most of us in this room have experienced trauma. And so here's what's really important. As I'm talking this evening, you're going to hear me talking about your children, and you're going to want to think about your children. But what I really want you to do is I want you to think about yourself. And the reason I want you to think about yourself is because that which you cannot see in yourself, it's impossible to see in others. There are going to be some components of everything I talk about tonight that will apply to you as adults who were once children. There's research that says some adults in times of stress have the ability to regress to infancy. Now, I don't want you to raise any hands, but how many of you women in here have husbands who get upset and act like babies? No hands raising. No hands raising. It is a biological phenomenon. It actually happens when we get stressed. We regress to earlier developmental zones of comfort. This is very important because it impacts, thank you, sir.
No problem.
It impacts us so much in every way, in every capacity. We've all been impacted. So I want you to keep that in mind, because your trauma experience ties into your child's trauma experience, which is what creates so much overwhelming stress in your home and in your relationship. So we're going to see through a trauma lens. We're no longer just going to be looking through the lens of behaviors. See, that's what everyone wants to focus on. We all want to focus on the behaviors of our children. Well, as long as you're focusing on the behaviors, you're coming from a place in your brain that is actually creating more of the stress that you're seeing. I'm going to say that again. As long as you're focused on the behavior, you're actually operating from a place in your brain that is creating more of the stress that you're trying to overcome. So I want to switch you from looking through a lens of behaviors through a trauma lens. Because when you start looking through a trauma lens, then everything has the potential to change. So trauma, let's define it, is any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, or unpredictable. Any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, or unpredictable. So we talk about your children having in utero experiences with alcohol or drug exposure. Right? Well, that's a prolonged stressful event. It changes the brain. But trauma is any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, or unpredictable. So you think about that as an adult. How many experiences in your life have been stressful that were prolonged, overwhelming, or unpredictable? And when you don't have an opportunity to talk about it, express, think about it and talk about it some more, process, and then develop some understanding about it, cry about it, be angry about it, be sad about it, as often as you need to. That's the difference between a short-term stressful experience and a long-term, potentially life-altering experience. So the difference between a stressful event that actually becomes trauma versus a stressful event that is just a stressful event is when you have an opportunity to express, process, and understand. Because it's through our ability to express, process, and understand that we actually have the capacity to heal and work through trauma. But when we don't have that, then we end up being stuck with it. It can impact our brain. Now, what you have to understand is that, and we'll talk about this in just a moment when I talk about the brain, is that a brain that has been exposed to overwhelming, unpredictable experiences of stress, prolonged experiences of stress, can actually shrink and shrivel. And that's what you realize, that's what you experience with a lot of your own children. But what brain research actually tells us is that those parts of the brain can be regenerated. Those parts of the brain aren't permanently damaged. They can be regenerated. They do grow. The most important parts of our brain, the social and emotional parts of our brain, have the capacity for change throughout the lifespan. So it's not hopeless. It can feel that way sometimes, but this evening I'm going to show you how many of the most common things we do with our children actually make it more difficult for them to heal and to develop and to progress. So these are all traumatic events. So many of your children haven't just experienced FASD. That's oftentimes what they get labeled as. But many of your children have experienced many of these events as well. So I could take a child from the U.S. who's experienced the same events, except the focus is on the abuse or neglect or the foster care or the frequent moves or the chronic pain, and not on the FASD, even though it's equally important. What you have to understand about FASD, and what you all of you probably already do understand, is it changes the way the brain processes information. It changes the way the brain retains information. Trauma does the same thing. Trauma changes the way the brain perceives information. What you're looking at is a trauma dynamic. You're looking at a trauma dynamic. And that trauma dynamic impacts all of us. So all of these are common traumatic events. Now, what do these events have in common? They all occur in the context of human relationships. Now, think about this for just a moment. And again, I want you to use, simultaneously work both sides of your spirit, thinking about yourself and thinking about your children. So let me start with this. Where was your mom when you were in her belly? Where was your mom when you were in utero? Where did she live? What was going on with her life? Where was dad? What were the circumstances? What were the environmental circumstances? I'm going to ask you to just think about this for a moment. What were the challenges that they experienced when you were in the tummy? As early as the 4th week after conception, the fetus has the ability to hear. As early as the 2nd trimester, the fetus has the ability to think. Psychological processing by the 2nd trimester. So we're living a whole experience before we even come into the world. And those experiences get buried in a part of your brain called the brainstem. Those are called pre-verbal experiences, pre-verbal memories. And those experiences and those memories have emotions connected to them. So what happens is when you get stressed out as an adult, if you get really stressed out, what gets stirred up is your brainstem. So that's why sometimes you act a certain way, which you know you shouldn't act that way. You shouldn't have to react that strongly. You shouldn't feel that strongly, but you do. And you don't always know why. You don't even know where it comes from. It's because it's probably coming from a birth imprint. Those are experiences that we don't just get away from in our life. They follow us. Now, let's think about your children. All of your children have been diagnosed with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So they've all been exposed in utero. If all of your children have been exposed to alcohol in utero, a toxic substance, carried through the womb of the person who's supposed to keep them safe, make them feel loved, make them feel warm and secure and nurtured, what connection do they have to a safety figure? How do they feel about a safety figure? If their safety figure has exposed them to toxins, what is their association to a safety figure? It's not safe. It's not safe. If the foundation of who I am exposes me to trauma, how can I believe that anyone else can keep me safe or make me feel safe? How can I believe that I can trust anyone else? How can I believe that anyone else can help me not feel fearful? How can I believe that anyone else can reduce my stress if the foundation of who I am didn't do it? But see, those are imprints in your children's brainstem. So you're actually battling those imprints all the time with your children. When they get really stressed out is when you're really going through it with them. Because when they get really stressed out, they drop into a place where they weren't safe at the very beginning of their development, at the very beginning of their life. Now, some of us drop into that same place too. But what about children just experience these things? When a child has experienced these traumas, they associate those traumas with adults. So adults don't become safe. That's why children try to figure it out for themselves. That's why they won't listen to you when they get really stressed out. That's why you can't tell them anything. Because they go into survival. Our bodies only know two emotional states. There are only two emotions, love and fear. Our bodies only know two energetic states. One is thriving, and the other is surviving. That's it. When you become really stressed, you constrict into survival. When your child becomes really stressed, your child constricts into survival. Now, here's where it gets challenging. Is because when we get stressed out and we constrict into survival, guess what we're wrapping ourselves around? All of those painful memories, all of those painful experiences, all of those painful emotions. And when we wrap ourselves around those painful emotions and those painful experiences, remember, sometimes these are pre-verbal. So there's not thoughts associated with them. That's why you look at your kids sometimes, you're like, you're just the craziest thing I've ever met. Because you can't make sense of anything or why they're doing what they're doing. Because it comes from an earlier place, because they're wrapped around nothing but pain. They're wrapped around stress and fear. They're wrapped into survival. And then when they get wrapped into survival, guess what that dictates? That dictates every other part of us. It dictates what we think. It dictates our ability to remember or not remember. It dictates how we feel. It dictates how our bodies move. It dictates everything. When we drop into that state and we drop and wrap around that trauma and those early experiences, it dictates everything. These are just additional traumatic events. And the reason I share these with you is because I want you to think outside of the box for trauma. I want you to think outside of the box. This is when we start to open up and realize that so many of us, most of us, at some level have experienced trauma. Most of us, on some level, have experienced generational trauma. Maybe it wasn't us. Maybe it was our parents. Maybe it was our grandparents. And generational trauma can get transmitted through the DNA. Through the DNA, you can have a reaction to something. You can feel a certain way about something, and it will not even be yours. That will have come from your parents. I just was in New York City just last week. I was working with a mom and her 16-year-old son. The mom, when she was in utero, was a secret. Her whole life, she grew up feeling like she was bad. Not only was it communicated to her, but that's what she was conceived in. That she was bad. When we got into working with her son, you know one of the first things he said was, "I'm bad." The message had gotten passed down. Unwittingly, unintentionally, it had gotten passed down. And that's what trauma does. That's how trauma gets transmitted through the DNA. So how many generations do you go back before you find trauma? Most of us don't go back very far before there's significant trauma. My great-grandfather still had slave marks on his back. He still had whip marks on his back. So that's extreme trauma just in 2 generations away. And that doesn't go away, it just gets passed down. So see, many of you have adopted children. So not only are we talking about your trauma as their adopted parents, but what about the biological parents' trauma and the generational trauma there? So now we're dealing with multiple things. Multiple ways in which it's compounded. And what that all leads to is a heightened level of sensitivity. A heightened level of sensitivity. They're all the same. I stopped diagnosing children 20 years ago. 20 years ago. If you've got a child who's experienced that, who has FASD, they've probably got post-traumatic stress disorder. Their attachment system is probably impaired. The attachment system is impaired because when we get stressed, we move into survival. When we move into survival, we can't develop secure attachment. Because of the way their brain has a difficulty in processing information, they're not always able to cycle through information. So their attention spans are affected. And then they're hypervigilant, so then they become more hyper. They're more hyper-aroused. They have learning disorders, bipolar. Bipolar is because the 2 sides of the brain don't function correctly the way they're supposed to. And autism spectrum. I literally stopped diagnosing children 20 years ago. The reason I stopped diagnosing children is because I realized that if there's a child in the home who's stressed out enough to have a diagnosis, then everyone in the home is stressed out. Everyone in the home is probably stressed out enough to have a diagnosis. And so when I just label the child, what I'm doing is I'm pointing the child out separate from everyone else. Then all of a sudden, everyone's focus becomes on the child because he's FASD. And then no one's focus is on their own work. No one's focus is on their own trauma. We're able to just say he's got FASD. We send him to therapy. We send him to the psychiatrist. But then we're being disempowered. The moment I label your child, I am disempowering you. I am disempowering you as parents to be able to create the healing environment that you are capable of creating. Every one of you is capable of creating the healing environment and the relationship that your child needs to be able to prosper. Every one of you. There's not some secret in a book, in a psychiatrist or a psychologist book. They don't have the answers. In fact, they're just going to make you more confused. We're just going to confuse you more and more and more and more. Because it's going to start with FASD, and then it's going to be FASD and PTSD, and then it's going to be FASD and PTSD and RAD, and then it's going to be FASD and PTSD and RAD and bipolar. And before you know it, your child's on 5, he's got 5 different diagnoses. 3 different, 4 different, 5 different medications. And they're still acting out. Right? I was doing a coaching call with a parent the other day. She said, Well, we really haven't wanted to take him off of his Abilify or Ritalin or Wellbutrin or whatever it was, but then she just got to tell me about the episode yet. You don't know. You don't know. You don't know. Let's talk about the brain because this becomes so important. The amygdala is your fear receptor in your brain. It's responsible for fight, flight, or freeze. Here's what happens when you have a child who's exposed to alcohol in utero. Their amygdala starts pumping out more cortisol because cortisol is supposed to help us fight off threats. But when the threat doesn't end, when the threat doesn't go away, it just keeps pumping out cortisol. And then guess what happens? The amygdala gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And it's as if the alcohol or the drugs weren't bad enough, the cortisol from the amygdala breaks down the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of your child's brain that's supposed to help them think clearly. It's supposed to help them send messages to their frontal lobe to help them be able to be effective in social and emotional relationships. It's one of the parts of their brain that's supposed to help them to be able to sit still and focus. So if the amygdala is not being interrupted in that cortisol outpouring, it just overwhelms the hippocampus even more. And then you got the alcohol and the toxins that are affecting the brain. And that's when the hippocampus starts to shrink and shrivel. See, a lot of times we think this is a matter of our children just won't do something. It's not. It's a matter of they can't. They can't. In any given moment, we're all doing the best that we can. That means you and I, as well as our children. We're doing the best we can with what we've got to work with. My brain can't handle any more stress. And so I don't know what to do with it. I can't calm it down. Because when your amygdala pumps out cortisol, it passes through another structure of your brain called the hypothalamus, which sits next to your pituitary gland. When the cortisol passes through the hypothalamus, it's supposed to release a hormone called oxytocin. So cortisol pumps out because there's a stressful event, because there's some kind of threat, and it's supposed to trigger your hypothalamus to release oxytocin. Oxytocin is your brain's anti-stress hormone. So when you're in the tummy and mama gets stressed, she calms herself down. When you're in the tummy and mommy gets hungry, which is stress, she eats. When you're in the tummy and mommy gets tired, which is stress, she sleeps. When you're in the tummy and mom gets a little anxious, she goes and sits down and breathes. Every time she does that, she starts engaging your hypothalamus and starts training your hypothalamus how to release oxytocin. Oxytocin is a learned response in the brain. It's a learned response, meaning you must be taught how to release oxytocin. How are you taught how to release oxytocin? Through your caregiver. Mom has to help turn that on, and then mom gets stressed. She needs dad to come and help soothe her. But what if there is no dad? What if mom's up all night long? What if mom's hungry a lot of the times? And then what if mom does drugs and she doesn't ever eat, therefore she doesn't sleep? Well, there's another structure of your brain that sits right alongside the hypothalamus. It's a little nerve bundle. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And it's responsible for your circadian rhythms. Now this is going to connect for all of them, because your circadian rhythms control your ability to know when you're hungry versus not hungry. It controls your ability to know when you're full versus when you're not full. It controls your ability to be able to relax and go to sleep at night. It controls your ability to wake up in the morning without being grumpy pants. When you've experienced a great amount of cortisol and stress, your circadian rhythms get knocked off. How many of you have children who have a difficult time calming down for bed? Sometimes they won't eat at all. Sometimes they eat all the time because their circadian rhythms aren't functioning the way they need to. Well, see, oxytocin helps all of that. Oxytocin helps our brain and our body-mind system, our brain and our body, the connection, helps regulate all of that cortisol. But when you didn't get it, you don't have it. So you gotta get it. When you didn't get it, you don't have it. So you've got to get it. And the way you get it is through our regulation. It's through our ability to calm our stress and turn on oxytocin, therefore engaging your hypothalamus, engaging your oxytocin response. I am responsible, if you're my child, I am responsible for teaching your brain how to turn on oxytocin. Every time I hug you, your brain turns on oxytocin. Every time you look at me and I look at you, your brain turns on oxytocin. Seen the two little kids running in here earlier, came in, last young man brought the jacket, then the little girl comes and she's telling mom a story and mom's looking her right in her face and she's smiling and the little girl's smiling. They're connecting, she's getting oxytocin. And mom tells her, don't bring your little butt back in here.
I said it more gently than that.
But she hasn't been back in. The reason she hasn't been back in is not because she felt threatened, but because she feels secure. And she'll come back in if she starts to feel insecure. Why? Because mom is the secure base. Mom is the source of regulation. Mom is the source of oxytocin. And so when we're able to connect and turn on oxytocin, our children can hear, which means they can learn, which means they can think. Now this is important. In times of stress, so when that cortisol is pumping out, in times of stress, our thinking becomes confused and distorted, and our short-term memory is suppressed. In times of stress, our thinking becomes confused and distorted. And I've been preaching that probably for 18 years because I think it just changes everything. If I can understand that when you're stressed out, you're not thinking clearly, and your short-term memory isn't working, meaning you don't even really recognize me. When you're stressed out, you don't even recognize me. When you're stressed out, you're not thinking clearly. If I can really internalize that, am I going to get mad at you? Am I going to yell at you? Am I going to hit you? Am I going to deprive you? I won't do any of those things. Why won't I? Because I know if I do, I'm just creating more stress for you. I know that if I do, I'm just turning off your short-term memory even more. A stressed out brain can't learn. A stressed out brain can't learn. That's such an easy principle. We have such a difficult time with it. You know why we have a difficult time with it? Because we get stressed. It's a two-way street. I can tell you a stressed out brain can't learn, and we can have a really difficult time with that because we get stressed out. And when we get stressed out, we focus on the behavior, meaning we focus on the threat, and we look to control and suppress and change the behavior, change the threat. If we're just focused on behaviors, we're operating from a place that our amygdala is dialed up and our oxytocin is dialed down. Well, what are your children going to need in order to heal? They're going to need oxytocin. So if they're stressed out and then you get stressed out, guess what happens? You can't help them. And if they're stressed out, you're stressed out, guess what happens? If we don't make it worse, we just prolong it. Children grow older, not better. Most children who are in traditional mental health, with traditional mental health practices, just grow older. They don't grow better. Because our focus is on the behavior. And as long as the focus is on the behavior, now I'm going to take you guys right down deep as long as the focus is on behavior, you're sending a vibration to your child that reinforces the behavior, because the behavior is coming from a vibration. When your child's amygdala is activated, they're sending off a vibration. That's why it stresses you out, because it turns on your amygdala. When you get stressed, you're sending back a bigger vibration. It's called a neurophysiologic feedback loop. There's a process called entrainment where we get connected in families. When your child is stressed and misbehaving, they're sending out a vibration. That vibration charges you. It zaps you. And you know what that feels like. You're like, ugh! Ugh! Now, if you're not mindful and aware of that, you dial right up with it. And then you send out a bigger vibration. And then they send out another vibration. And you send out a bigger vibration. And as long as they're probably 10 years old, eventually you can suppress that behavior. But what happens when they hit pre-adolescence and adolescence? You can't suppress it anymore, can you? Then you really start flailing helplessly. And that's the sad thing, is that a lot of times we have our children young. We have the greatest opportunities when the brain is the youngest. And because so many of the things we're taught actually dial up more stress than dialing up oxytocin. So many of our traditional ingrained patterns for parenting and relationships dial up more stress. They don't dial up oxytocin. So what this leaves your child with, and this is the way I want you to start thinking about your child. I'm going to make it really simple for you. They are stress sensitive and fearful. Stress sensitive and fearful. Your child can have a stress reaction. Now, a reaction is without thought. It's unconscious. And it's all emotion. It's all emotion. Your child can have a reaction at a level below consciousness that they don't even realize it, through what they see, what they smell, what they hear, what they touch, what they taste, the temperature of their bodies, digestion, and movement. You have 8 pathways at any one time that can cause your child to have a stress reaction because they're so sensitive. They have sensitive brains. I like to use this analogy sometimes. Probably fits up here because it's kind of chilly. You know, it gets really cold. What happens to a pond? Starts to ice over, right? And the colder it gets, the thicker the ice gets, right? Well, your child's brain is oftentimes like that pond. But that ice for them is not that thick to begin with. That ice for them isn't as thick as it may look. And so when they get stressed, that ice starts to melt. Depending on their histories, depending on their level of sensitivities, when they get stressed, the heat really turns up. And when the heat really turns up, they break right through that ice. And when they break right through that ice, everything that's underneath that ice is their trauma. Everything underneath that ice is every painful thing they've ever experienced. It's all the pain, it's all the yuckiness, it's dark and it's murky down there. It's like if you pour dirt in a glass of water, over time, the dirt and the sediment sinks to the bottom. But as soon as you shake it up, all of a sudden everything becomes muddy again. And you can just keep doing that over and over and over again. Well, that's the same thing with trauma. That's the same thing with FASD. When your child gets stressed, that ice heats up. And as soon as they bust through it, they go right into the brainstem where all the yuckiness is at. And then guess what happens? That's what becomes their reality. All of those emotions that they can't make any sense out of It's what becomes their reality. That's why they act so crazy in that moment. Because that's their reality, every rejection they've ever felt. So not only are we talking about, especially for adopted foster children, not only are we talking about FASD, but you're talking about the earliest form of rejection and abandonment and loss. You know, you can't just tease those things out. You can't just say, well, this is the FASD that I'm seeing. Oh, I think this is the adoption stuff. Oh, this is that ADHD stuff. You don't separate all that stuff. All that stuff is mixed in the bottom with all the other muck. And as soon as the stress sets in, depending on how high the stress is depending on how high the temperature is, depending on what their experiences have been, is depending on how solid that ice is. This is why right now, all of your children, and this is why you should commend yourself. This is why you should actually feel good about your role as parents right now. Because most of you have children who are in that room with a bunch of other children and they're all stressed out. Because peer physiology, I want you to hear this, peer physiology is equivalent to the same physiology as stress. So when kids, anytime kids are all together, and that's why school systems are so challenging for kids, especially our kids, because they're already sensitive. Anytime there's a bunch of kids together, they're all stressed out because that's just pure physiology. But your children aren't running in here. Your children haven't been sitting in here. The worker hasn't come in here and said, hey, you need to come get your kid. You know why? Because their ice is thick. You've helped them to accomplish that. You've helped them to accomplish a layer that keeps them from dropping into that muck. Now, by the time we get done, if no one's had any kids come in here, I'll be surprised. I like it when they do come in. Because when they do come in, what that's telling you is that they're checking in with you. They're telling you when they come in that they've gone outside of their window of tolerance, and they might not come in mad. They might come in with the happiest look on their face. But excitement and stress come from the same part of the brain. Excitement and stress are both fear-connected feelings. But they come in and check in. And every time your child checks in with you, it's like you turn the temperature down and cool everything down again. Cool it down. Cool it down. And that's what happens when your child sends you a vibration of stress and fear, and they're constantly sending you vibrations of stress and fear, and you don't respond, or you don't react. See, there's a difference between a reaction and a response. A reaction is emotional and unconscious and has no thought. It's just automatic. A response is conscious and has thought. So there's a difference between reacting and responding. When you react, you're not thinking. It's all emotional. And that's what your amygdala does. Your amygdala immediately dials up. It doesn't respond, it reacts. When you're able to sustain a level of stress, when you're able to sustain a level of temperature, a level of heat, without collapsing through, I call that your window of tolerance. We all have a window of tolerance for how much stress we can handle. Right now, your children are utilizing their window of tolerance. That's why when you leave tonight, they're probably going to be stressed out. See, what we typically do is we say, well, we were there for 2 hours and you did just fine. You played with all the kids. Didn't you have fun? Didn't you guys have a good time? Why are you acting like this? What's the deal? And some therapist man told you, well, they're just taking it out on you. So then as soon as you have that message in the back of your brain, you get a little frustrated, don't you? I don't see why this happens all the time. Well, it has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the fact that their window of tolerance has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. By the time you get ready to go home, it's eclipsed. Some kids can't go 10 minutes. See, sometimes you have to do a little investigation and find out what your child's window of tolerance is for how much stress they can handle. I mean, truly, the best thing for all of you would be if we all got up and walked in there and you gave the kids a hug. And then we all came back in. Now, we know that's a little bit disruptive, right? But that would be the best thing. Is if you went, you checked in. Because every time you check in, you're cooling the ice. You're cooling the ice. But how were most of us raised? We were raised that if you don't hear no one screaming for their life, ain't no broken bones, leave them alone. And so we leave them alone till they get exhausted. And then that's when you hear people screaming for their lives or things get broken. Instead of going in and interrupting the window of tolerance. That's why a lot of times in schools, one of the first things I'll recommend for parents to do with your child who's having problems in school is call them at 10 o'clock in the morning. Call them and say, hey, I need to talk to my child. No school's going to turn you down for that. The first thing you put in your head, though, is that they are. That's a fear-based stop. No school's going to keep you from talking to your kid. And you just say, hey, babes, I was thinking about you. Want you to know I love you, and I can't wait to see you when you get home from school. And they'll be like, okay, weird. But what it does is it resets their window of tolerance. It cools the ice. See, the goal is to keep cooling the ice. Keep cooling the ice so they can handle more and more stress. More and more stress. But when they do fall through the ice, the goal then is not to create more stress. When your child falls through the ice and they're misbehaving all over the place, the worst thing to do is to pull out the blowtorch. You've got to be able to cool the ice. If you can't cool the ice and you got the blowtorch on, it's not going to be good. You know what that looks like, don't you? You know what it looks like when your child falls through the ice and you fall right through your own ice. You fall right through your own ice. That's turning on the blowtorch. Everything gets stressful. So what we ultimately want to do is we want to turn on oxytocin for our children so that we can help them develop oxytocin. You develop oxytocin through hugs, through eye contact, through eating together, through playing together, through wrestling. One of the best things a dad can do, one of the best things a dad can do with a child who's diagnosed with any diagnosis, but especially FASD, ADHD, is wrestle with your child. Wrestle with your child. Get in the middle of the floor, get down on your knees, and wrestle. I prefer you get your shirts off, take your shirts off like some cavemen, and just get after it. And just lay on them. Lay on them, and then let them get you down. Let them win. And then what you're doing is you're actually regulating their brain in the process. And then when you get tired, when you're done, because we're out of shape, right? When we get done, all you got to do is just lay there on the floor. Say, I'm done. And they're going to keep wrestling you. Just say, I'm done. And they're going to keep wrestling you. Just say, I'm done. And they're going to stop wrestling. You pull them down just like that. We have the ability to amp our kids up. We have the ability to pull them back down. And as we're doing that, we're exercising both sides of their brain. Left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. We're exercising. That's that structure, that corpus callosum in their brain that helps that development, that helps them start to think clearly in the midst of stress. We have to be able to think clearly in the midst of stress, but the only way we can get there is if we start to develop some of those mechanisms in our brain. So much of what we do with our children is focused on external. See, when you're focused on your child's behavior and you're not focused on your child's trauma, when you're focused on their behavior and not their stress, when you're focused on their behavior and not their fear, then what you're doing is ignoring the parts of them that are actually causing the behavior. See, that behavior is coming from somewhere. It's coming from a deeper place. And as long as we're focused on behavior, we're focused on the wrong place. We got to get underneath the behaviors. I call that ignore the behavior, don't ignore the child. That's hard to do. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. But I want you to understand why it's hard to do. It's hard to do because we all have an amygdala. We all have a fear receptor in our brain. And all of our fear receptors in our brain has experiences. So as soon as there's a threat, and any behavior is a threat. As soon as your child lies, steals, becomes hyperactive, runs around, won't listen, that's a threat, and your amygdala turns on. And your amygdala immediately wants to reduce, control, suppress, change the threat. We've got to be able to override our own amygdalas. Now think about this. It's our ability to turn on our own oxytocin. It's our ability to engage our own clear thinking and our own short-term memory that helps us be able to regulate our children. It's our ability to regulate ourselves that helps us regulate our children. If we can't regulate ourselves in the midst of our children's stress, it's not fair for us to expect them to regulate themselves because they don't have it. We already know they're working at a diminished capacity. That diminished capacity, that FASD diagnosis that your children has means they have an impaired ability to regulate their stress. That's what it means. They have an impaired ability to regulate sensory input. You follow me? They can't regulate it as effectively as you may be able to, as some other child their age may be able to. But another one of the challenges is that our children look like every other kid. Our child is just as big as every other kid. Sometimes they're just as smart as every other kid. That's the chronological, the cognitive, the physical. But what about the emotional? Emotional is what takes over in stress. Your children aren't 15, aren't 8, they're not 18. They're not 15, they're not 10, they're not 5 in stress. Sometimes they're babies. Sometimes they're babies. That 18-year-old isn't 18. That 18-year-old is probably a 5-year-old. That 15-year-old is probably a 2-year-old. But what we do is we try to talk to the 18-year-old. We try to talk to the 15-year-old. Here's the thing, guys. We all do it. When we stress, we regress. We all do it. This is not just our children. When we stress, we regress. Sometimes I can stress and act like an infant, act like a rejected, abandoned baby, and feel like a rejected, abandoned baby. I can still have that feeling. At 46 years old, I was adopted as a baby. I was in foster care for a little bit of time. At 46 years old, I can still have that feeling of being a vulnerable, helpless, scared baby. The only difference is that now I'm aware of it. So when that comes up, I'm able to breathe into it. Sometimes I'm able to give into those feelings and have a good cry. Because the more I do that, the more conscious of it I become. So the less ability it has to take control. The more I'm able to recognize my own pain, connect my own stress, become aware of my own challenges and my own struggles, my own fears, the more capable I am of calming that down. See, we all have those experiences. You think it's your child that's the source of the problem, but it's not. It's what your child's triggering in you. That was there a long time ago. When you're in a big screaming match with your kid, you're every much as 5 years old as they are too. And I don't say that in jest. I say that as a physiological reality. And all you've got to do is stop and take a deep breath. And you say, where am I at right now? But see, that requires your ability to stop focusing on your kid. That requires your ability to stop focusing on this out here and focus on this in here. Because you connect to where am I at right now? Why am I arguing with a 10-year-old? Why am I feeling like I want to choke this 15-year-old right now? Because you feel helpless. Because you feel out of control. because you feel scared, because you feel stressed. Where does that feeling come from? When was the first time you experienced that feeling? When was the first time in your life you experienced that feeling? Because that's where you're going to. That's where you drop back to. And when you drop back to that place, you act out of that place. Except now, you're bigger and stronger and smarter. So you protect yourself. But as you're protecting yourself, you're not protecting your child. When you start protecting yourself, you're not protecting your child. And your child is in a place in that moment to where they feel all alone. They're in a place in that moment where they feel vulnerable. They're in a place in that moment where they feel helpless. They're in a place in that moment where they feel terrified. And when you start protecting yourself out of your own stress, you're not protecting your child. Every time your child drops into their junk, their stress, their outbursts, whatever the behaviors may be, every time they drop into that, they're dropping into a place where they don't feel safe anymore. They don't feel protected anymore. They don't feel like anyone cares. They're dropping into a place where they experience in the earliest parts of their life, they're dropping into their muck. They're dropping into their muck. And if you turn on the blowtorch, you're just boiling it. They need you to go in the muck and get them. But the only way you can go in the muck and pull them out is by not getting so overwhelmed with your own stress, with your own anxiety, with your own fear, with your own shock. And the only way you can do that is you got to start paying attention. See, every moment is an opportunity for healing. When it comes to working with trauma, when it comes to working with stress, it comes to working with fear, every moment is an opportunity for healing. Every moment. And your kids give you plenty of moments. They give you plenty of moments. In fact, the best time to create healing is when your child is in the midst of the nastiest episode possible. When they are in the midst of the nastiest episode possible, that is the most beautiful opportunity. It's the most beautiful opportunity for you, and it's the most beautiful opportunity for them. Because when they are being their absolute nastiest, that's when you want to get absolutely nasty with them. Because you're in your stuff. But when they can be so nasty, and you realize in that moment that you're looking at a scared, vulnerable, helpless, overwhelmed, all alone 2-year-old, and you go, oh my God, honey. Let it out. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I love you. I'm here. Give it to me. I'm not going to leave you. I'm right here. You go in the muck with them. It's like you go in the muck with a life preserver. Right? You're jacketed up and you drop down in there. So you drop down in there, you're going to float back to the top. You drop down in there and grab them and float back up to the top. That's how you pull a child out of stress. You pull a child out of stress by staying regulated, by staying connected, by staying present. When your child becomes stressed out, they go into the past. When we become stressed out as adults, we do 2 things. 3 things, really. When we become stressed out, 3 things happen. We're reacting from the past. All your past stuff's coming up. Or we're obsessing about the future. Oh my God, when he's 20, what's going to happen? Even though he's 5 right now. But you're not in the present. And when you're not in the present, nothing matters. Nothing matters. In the present, you're a lot safer than you think you are. In the present, you have a lot more opportunities to help your child than you think you do. In the present. But here's what I want to tell you guys, is you can't fix your children. You've got this notion in your brain that you're going to make your children little mini yous. You're not going to be able to do it. That's not their path. That's not their journey. Your responsibility is not to create a mini-me. Your responsibility is to raise up a child until they are mature. And to be in relationship with them. And to teach them responsibility. Right? The only way you can teach a child responsibility is by being responsible. that many of you have been taught that you teach children responsibility by giving them consequences. That's not teaching responsibility. That's called teaching reactivity. The only time you give a child a consequence is when they have a misbehavior. So if the only time you give a child a consequence is when they misbehave, that's called reacting. You're reacting. So what ends up happening is you end up modeling how to be reactive. If you want to teach your child responsibility, you have to take responsibility. We'll talk about that in a moment. Regulation and dysregulation. Regulation is the ability to experience stress within your window of tolerance. That's what your children are doing right now. They're experiencing stress within their window of tolerance. They're experiencing stress, but they're functioning. They're playing. They're having a good time. They're regulated. We're all regulated right now. Dysregulation is the experience of stress outside of your window of tolerance. This is a very, very, very important scientific finding. It is believed that affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. It is believed that affect dysregulation, being stressed out, is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. I say it is believed that being stressed out is the fundamental cause of all psychological, emotional, and behavioral challenges. I made it real simple. I'm going to make that real simple for you. Being stressed out is the fundamental cause of all psychological, emotional, behavioral challenges that you experience. And I've been saying that for 20 years. 20 years. And I know it to be true. The biggest challenges you have with your child at any time is when they are stressed out. And the bigger challenge is when they're stressed out and you're stressed out too. And then the bigger challenge beyond that is figuring out how to get yourself calm so you can get them calm. So if being stressed out is the fundamental cause of all psychological, emotional, and behavioral challenges, what is the number one thing you have to do? Reduce stress. Reduce stress. Now take a deep breath. Why are we going to take a deep breath? Because breathing is the one proven way to interrupt your stress. It's the one proven way. When we become stressed, the first thing we do is we stop breathing. We're going to take a deep breath because when we start to take deep breaths, all of a sudden our thinking comes back online. When we take deep breaths, all of a sudden our short-term memory turns back on. It's very, very important. Our ability to breathe in the midst of stress is probably the single most powerful thing you can do in any situation. Because if you don't breathe, if you don't make the effort, it's not about telling the other person, hey, you need to take a deep breath. You need to calm down. Did you not hear Brian last night? He said you need to breathe. Our ability to breathe turns down our vibration of negativity. When we start to breathe, we turn down our negative vibration and we turn up our oxytocin response. The single most important thing you can do in the midst of your child's behavior challenges is breathe. Really, your only goal. Your only goal. I mean, if I have nothing else to offer you, I would tell you in any moment, your only goal is to breathe. I don't need you to talk. I don't need you to use a magic formula. I don't need you to say magic words. I just need you to breathe. I had a mom once whose daughter she had bath time problems. Bath time, every single night, bath time battle. She said, this is 67, her mom was 67, the little girl was 9 years old, adopted child. Every single night I go in her room and I say, it's time to take a bath, and she flips out on the ground kicking and screaming. Every single night. It's been doing this since she was 5 years old. She said, so I just jump on her and I just hold her down. She restrains her, right? Until she calms down. And then we go in the bathroom. She sees the bathtub and she starts flipping out again. But this time she's going to get in that tub whether she likes it or not. Water splishing and splashing. Even if I got my clothes on, she's going to get that bath. We don't even think about washing her hair. Then we both fall out of the tub exhausted, water everywhere. And then she won't go to sleep. What do I do about it? Here was my response to her. I said, the next time it's time to take a bath, when she starts flipping out on the ground, kicking and screaming, I don't want you to get mad at her. I don't want you to jump on her. All I want you to do is sit on the bed and take 3 to 10 deep breaths. And then email me back and let me know how you were feeling. You hear what my response to her was? Had nothing to do with the child. Nothing to do with the child. All I said is, all I want you to do. See, first of all, I'm investigating. This is how you investigate a scenario. Some of these behavior problems you've been having with your children, you've been having them over and over and over again. But because you've been having them over and over and over again, what that means is you've been doing the same thing over and over expecting a different result. Right? When you've been doing the same thing for 1 year and 2 years and 3 years and you keep getting the same result, Einstein said that's the definition of insanity. We get so stressed out. This is so important. This is going to be good. We get so stressed out, our amygdala starts releasing cortisol. We stop thinking clearly. And our short-term memory gets turned off. And so we handle behavior one way, and the next day, the same behavior shows up again. And guess what we do? We handle it the exact same way. And 5 years later, guess what? We're still handling it the same way. And we think our kids are crazy. The reason you have to breathe, and you have to understand that right now, in this moment, you're probably negatively conditioned. So right now, you've been holding your breath and locked. Right now, you are conditioned for stress. And I want you to understand the magnitude of this. You're conditioned, not only are you conditioned for stress, but you have created pathways in your brain. You have created synaptic connections in your brain. You've got neural circuitry in your brain that is wired for stress. So right now, today, your brain is wired for stress. That tells you how hard this is. See, I can say it can seem so simple, but you are literally changing your brain. And the reason you're going to have such a hard time, because some of you are going to go home tonight, your kids are going to start acting out. You're going to do the same thing that you did last night, but then you're going to stop. And you're going to be like, I need to breathe. The reason you start to do the same thing is because you're conditioned. Your kids are the same way. But see, your children follow you. They follow you. They do the same thing, you do the same thing, they do the same thing. And so I said to the mom, I want you to stop. I want you to sit on the bed. I want you to take 3 to 10 deep breaths. And I want you to email me back and let me know how you felt. She called me back a few nights later. She said, well, I did what you said. I went in the bedroom, told her it's time to take a bath. She started kicking and screaming like she always does. But this time, instead of jumping on her, I sat in the bed. I sat on the bed. She said, I felt like an idiot sitting on the bed while my 9-year-old was throwing a tantrum in the middle of the floor. But do you realize in less than 10 seconds, she completely stopped what she was doing, climbed up on my lap as if she needed a hug, realized that she didn't, and then she went and got in the bathtub? She said, that was too much for my old heart. That was the beginning of the end of their bath time battles. Because change can happen that fast. When something you do is so profound in that moment, your brain can change just like that. Not always. Sometimes it can be pretty ingrained and pretty conditioned. You can have some patterns. A lot of your her patterns, a lot of the patterns for the reason you parent your children, the way you parent them, come from grandma and grandpa. They don't even come from mom and dad. They come all the way back from grandma and grandpa. You're just parenting on autopilot, right? So it can be hard to change that, but it can happen. You can do that. Now, I had another mom in my lecture, I told that same story, and she said, my daughter has always had a problem taking a shower. What's interesting is that both these girls were 9 years old, and then both their names were Christine. Mom heard me tell the story. Her name's Lanelia. Her daughter had always had a hard time taking a shower. She said every single night when I go in to tell my daughter to take a shower, it's just like this battle. And it's been that way for the last 5 years. So I heard you tell that story, and I decided I was gonna be calm. In fact, I do it's called the 3-phase intervention: reflect, relate, and regulate. As long as your child is not at risk of harming themselves or someone else, the first thing you have to do is you have to stop, take 3 to 10 deep breaths, and reflect on how you feel. How you feel. Now, sometimes that's a little tricky because depending on what our own experiences are, depending on what our own stories are, your child can be yelling and you think you're at risk. That's your own story. So you have to really determine if they're at risk of harming themselves or someone else. You have to stop, take 3 to 10 deep breaths, and connect with how you feel. That's called reflecting. And then you relate by saying to your child, I feel this way, how are you feeling? A lot of times they're going to say, I don't know, because they don't know. Because they're not in that part of their brain. They're not in the thinking part of their brain. They're in the emotional part of their brain. So they're going to say, I don't know. And you say, well, I'm feeling scared right now. I'm feeling pretty stressed right now. I bet you're feeling stressed too. And then as soon as you start relating, as soon as you start to relate, regulation starts to happen automatically. Reflect, relate, regulate. So Lanelia said, I went upstairs. This time I was breathing. I mentioned to my daughter, I said, it's time to take a shower. Sure enough, she started talking back and rolling her eyes like she always does. But this time I was very calm, and I said, honey, if you need anything, I'll be right there. She said, my daughter went and got in the shower. That was amazing. But sure enough, she did what she always does. Mom, the water's too hot, it's too cold. I don't like this towel, I don't like this soap. And Mom said, usually just bugs the heck out of me. Makes me so frustrated. But this time I was calm. I went in, I got what she needed. I pulled up a chair and I said, honey, I'm going to sit right here. If you need anything else, Mama's going to sit right here. She said, my daughter, my 9-year-old daughter, got out of the shower. That was the best shower we have had in 5 years. So I thought I'd go for a home run. So I went, daughter went to her bedroom. I sat on the bed. I sat my 9-year-old. She had a towel wrapped around her. She sat next to me. I put my arm around her and I said, honey, that was the best shower we've had in 9 years. What scares you so much about taking a shower? She said, my daughter looked at me and said, well, Mom, the guy who sexually molested me made me take a shower with him. Mom knew about the molestation. She didn't know about the shower. Mom said, still regulated, still breathing. Mom said, honey, you don't have to take a shower anymore. You can take a bath. 2 weeks later, when she sent me that email, she said, my daughter takes a bath now so fast I hardly even know she's in and out. 5 minutes to overcome 5 years. Just by looking at things differently. If you guys don't have a copy of Fear to Love, you should grab a copy. Go to feartolovebook.com. It's free. Just pay the shipping and handling. Educational success model. Jody, how are we doing on time?
45 minutes.
45. Oh, gosh. All right, real quick. This is important when it comes to school. It's also important when it comes to home. And you guys can probably email and get these slides from Jody. She's got it. When you are in a survival and reacting place, meaning when your child is acting out, and I did this for schools, when a child is acting out, they're in their amygdala and in their brainstem, right? They've fallen through the ice. They've fallen through the ice, they're in the muck. And when you're in your amygdala and in your brainstem, guess what you're in? You're in survival. Guess what you can't do in survival? You can't learn. You can't learn when you're in survival. So the best thing to do, and one of the things we do too much of when our children are in survival, is we talk to them. We try to lecture them. We try to explain. Stop talking. Stop talking and start breathing. And you might say at the most, I see you. I hear you. Tell me more. Tell me more. But stop talking because they can't hear you. If you're talking, it means you're anxious. And if you're anxious, it means you're stressed. And if you're stressed, it means your cortisol vibrations turned up. Your negative vibrations turned up and your oxytocin's turned down. If you're anxious, it's because you're not breathing and regulating yourself. And if you're anxious and not breathing and regulating yourself, guess what you can't do with your child? You can't regulate them. Any of you parents suffer from high anxiety? It's so interesting when a parent is really anxious because typically their child is super sensitive and they're just like buzzing each other all the time. And interesting enough, I see it the most with the child who's regressed, who's withdrawn. The hypoaroused child, I call it the turtle child. The child who isolates. You see, that's a highly sensitive child too. But what happens is the parent's anxiety turns up. When the parent's anxiety turns up, the child gets overwhelmed and goes away, which then causes the parent's anxiety to go up even more. And then the parent wants to go to them and touch them and try to talk to them and spend time with them. And the child's like, leave me alone, leave me alone. The best thing you can do when you have a child that turtles, I call them turtles because they go in their shell. All of you have seen turtles when you were kids growing up, right? If you tried shaking the turtle out of the shell, was it very effective? It wasn't. The best thing you can do is get quiet. Calm yourself down. Be patient. Be present. We eventually all had those turtles as pets, didn't we? We put them in a box and gave them tomatoes and lettuce and grass. And we eventually could go and pick that turtle up and hang out with the turtle, right? And it wouldn't be scared anymore. Well, some of your children are the same way. You have to calm yourself down. You have to dial your anxiety down. Otherwise, it keeps feeding you. So, when a child is in survival and reacting, they're in their amygdala and their brainstem. You got to get them to respond. You get them to respond first and foremost by breathing and calming down your own anxiety. Then you make eye contact. Sometimes you don't make eye contact. Children don't make eye contact with you not because they're being disrespectful. Let's just dispel that myth right there. Your child's not making eye contact with you because they're disrespecting you. Your child's not making eye contact with you because they are stressed out. And eye contact is the most direct way to stimulate the prefrontal cortex, your social and emotional control center. Eye contact, the most direct way to stimulate the social and emotional control center. So if you're already stressed out, guess what the first thing we do is? We stop making eye contact. And then guess what we do? We stop listening, right? And then what do? We don't want to be touched. Anytime your child's not looking at you, when your child's acting like they're not listening to you, when they don't want to be touched, it's because they're stressed. They're stressed. They've gone outside of their window of tolerance. A defiant child is a scared child. I want you to remember that. A defiant child is a scared child. When your child's looking like they're ignoring you, when it looks like they're being defiant, it's because they are stressed. They're stressed. And in that stress, they're constricting. And in that constricting, they're just turtling, trying to be safe. Even if it doesn't look like there's nothing to be afraid of. A defiant child is a scared child. Then you move them up to processing. Get them to start thinking, then you finally get up to learning. The prefrontal cortex is thriving and integrating. That part of your brain, that prefrontal cortex, is open for development until you're throughout the lifespan. But it doesn't mature until you're 25. So your social and emotional control center doesn't mature until you're 25 years old. So think about that perspective for your child. Your children, most of your children are so far off of full brain maturity that if they've experienced early trauma in their lives, that they're pushed back even further. That 25 may mean 27, could mean 28, could be 29, 30. Depends on what those early experiences are. 3 pathways of emotional expression. We all have 3 pathways through which we express our emotions. Attitudes, feelings, and behaviors. When you were a child, was it safe for you to roll your eyes at your parents? How many can say they can safely roll their eyes at their parents? Not many, ever. What'd you know? What'd you hear? Don't roll your eyes at me. I'll knock your eyeballs in the back of your head. Attitudes were not safe. But an attitude is a pathway of emotional expression, meaning we have pathways of emotional expression as a way to transition. We express through our emotions to transition. When you were rolling your eyes at your parents, you were trying to transition energy in order to deal with whatever thing it was that they were asking you to do. But you couldn't roll your eyes. And so if you can't roll your eyes, if you can't express your attitudes, what about feelings? How many of you could freely cuss your parents out and still maintain life? No, we wouldn't even think about it, right? Feelings is an attitudinal expression. It's an emotional expression. We express through our feelings so we can transition emotion. So I can transition this energy to stop doing what I'm doing here and go do what it is you're asking me to do. I do the same thing with attitudes. I do the same thing with feelings. There are pathways for emotional expression so I can transition. But guess what? We have all these generational imprints and messages and conditioning that says if you roll your eyes at me, you're being disrespectful. It says if you cuss me out, you're being disrespectful. None of those say you're rolling your eyes because you're trying to adjust and make a transition. None of that messaging says you're cussing at me right now because you're really upset and you're expressing your feelings so you can work through this energy so you can transition and accept what it is I'm telling you to accept. None of that conditioning tells us that. But that's what these things are, because guess what? If you can't express through your attitudes and you can't express through your feelings, you drop down to behaviors. How many of you can freely express your behaviors? Now, we really didn't express behaviors, right? But if you can't express attitudes and you can't express feelings and you drop down to behaviors and you can't express behaviors, guess what you're left with? Anger and depression. Anger and depression have to come through behaviors. Anger and depression have no other outlet except for behaviors. How many of your children right now are stuck in negative behaviors? Because they're stuck in anger and depression. And I say that anger, depression, and behaviors, it's the trauma triangle. When you have a child who experiences anger, depression, and behaviors in your home for 6 months or longer, that's living in an environment of trauma. So if you have a child who is expressing anger and depression and behaviors for 6 months or longer, you're all experiencing trauma. Everyone's experiencing trauma. And all that stress is storing up what other trauma you might have. But guess what? This is where our children end up stuck. This is where they're at. Why are they here? Why are they at the level of anger and depression and behaviors? Because of our beliefs that you can't express attitudes and you can't express feelings. But as adults, we express attitudes and feelings all day long, don't we? But anger, depression, and behaviors, the trauma triangle, is where you get diagnosis. It's where you get residential treatment. It's where you get medication. And all those things are just focused on suppressing behaviors. You notice that? Residential treatment, medication, diagnosis, they're all for suppressing behaviors. But if they're suppressing behaviors, guess what it's going to drive the child to? Anger or depression, which has got to come out through behavior. So what happens is behaviors become the conditioned pathway in the brain. Your children are acting out of their behaviors because they have no other outlet. They have no other outlet. We've not created any other outlet for them to express other than behaviors. I really want you to see that. When your child rolls their eyes at you, that's probably one of the best, most beautiful things they could possibly do. You should be thanking them for that eye roll. Thanking them for that huff and puff. Thanking them for that back talk. Tell them how much you love them. Because that is going to get them to transition and and go do what it is you asked them to do. When they're fussing and they're cussing, let me tell you this. Let me ask you a question. Let's take a poll. Who would prefer to be cussed out or have the windows broken in your house? We'll take cussing out all day, right? We're over being hit. I'm like, please cuss me, don't hit this. Please cuss me. Because as long as you're cussing me, guess what you're not doing? You're not hitting me. As long as you're cussing me, you're not breaking my freaking windows out. Which costs me money. Right? But we have the ability to catch our children in attitudes. We catch them in attitudes, and a lot of times I just say with an attitude, don't say nothing. Just say a little silent prayer. Yes. 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 But if attitudes aren't okay, we're going to suppress them into their feelings. You want feelings. You don't want to suppress feelings. You want feelings. Feelings are your friend. When you are getting feelings from your child, that is the best thing they could possibly give you. That is the biggest gift you could get from your child, is their expression of feelings, because feelings represent vulnerability. If I am expressing my feelings to you, I am feeling vulnerable. If I'm feeling vulnerable, I'm in my muck. It's like I'm skating right around my muck, which means I'm giving you a deep part of me. And all I need you to do is take some deep breaths and say, I hear you. I hear you. Tell me more. Thank you for sharing it with me. It's got to be authentic, though. It's got to be real. Thank you for letting me know that. I'd like to hear more. And you know what you're doing? You're keeping them from dropping through behaviors. And then what you end up doing is when they start experiencing those same levels of stress and wanting to pursue that same pathway in their brain that they've been pursuing, that they're now conditioned to pursue, you start giving them the opportunity to create and form a new pathway. As soon as you stop increasing the stress in the midst of their stress, you give their brain one little seed. I call it a love weed seed, because weeds grow in all environments. You plant one little love weed seed in their brain that starts to grow a new synaptic connection, a new dendrite that will then grow another dendrite, which will grow another dendrite, which eventually will create a new pathway that when I get stressed, I don't have to go down the old pathway anymore. I can choose a new pathway. But I need you to show me that. I need you to give me an opportunity to be vulnerable. Let me yell if I need to yell. Let me cuss if I need to cuss. Has anybody died from being cussed out? Ever? No! Has anyone ever had a heart attack from your child rolling their eyes at you? Anybody has windows ever got broke out? From a child eye rolling? That's some powerful eye rolling. Right? Children drop into behaviors because they've been conditioned that way. What we have to do is we have to recondition them. We have to recondition them, and unfortunately, they're already conditioned, same way we're conditioned. But we have to change first. We have to change first. We start the process of change. They're going to keep doing what they've always been doing. But all of a sudden, we're doing something different. When we start doing something different, they start having the opportunity to do something different. As long as we keep doing what we've always been doing, they're going to keep doing the same thing they've always been doing. There's no magic formula to that, guys. There's no magic formula to that. If you just keep behaving the same way you've behaved, if you keep parenting the same way you've been parenting, your kids are going to keep doing the exact same thing. And if 5 years or 10 years or 15 years isn't enough to tell you that maybe you should consider doing something different, I don't know what is. Wait another 5 years. There'll come a time when eventually you'll be like, maybe I should do something different. And guess what? That's the beauty. That's the beauty of being a human being. That's the beauty of being a child of God. Is that there's no time in your life when change isn't possible. Your children don't hit a certain age and they can't be helped. There's always an opportunity. But you just have to do things differently. The stress funnel says all behavior arises from a state of stress. I created this in 2001. I wrote my doctoral dissertation around the stress model. 2001, so I've been teaching it ever since because it was a breakthrough in my life. It was a breakthrough in my understanding. All behavior arises from a state of stress. In between the behavior and the stress is the presence of a primary emotion. There are only two primary emotions, love and fear. Those are your only two primary emotions. It's through the expression, the processing, and the understanding of the fear that we can calm the stress and diminish the behavior. It's very simple. All the behavior problems you are encountering come from stress, and that stress drives the emotion of fear, and that fear is what's driving that behavior. It's through your ability to express, process, and understand that fear that you calm that stress and diminish that behavior. And if you do that over and over and over again, the behaviors start to go away. But you have to remember, this is not a behavior issue. This is a stress and trauma and fear issue. This is not something about your children just choosing to behave a certain way. See, that's very cognitive, and that's what most therapists and most counselors want to tell you, is your child's just making bad choices. Yes, they're making bad choices, but the reason they're making bad choices is because they're operating from a place of trauma and stress and fear. And if we don't help them work through the trauma and stress and the fear that keeps dictating to them, they're going to keep having the same behavior problems. You can't just focus on the behavior and expect the child to change, because it doesn't work that way. You got to help them work through the pain. You got to help them work through the emotion. You got to help them work through the fear. You got to help them feel in the midst of that stress and that fear that they're safe, that they're loved, that they're not going to be abandoned, that they're not going to be rejected. You got to help them understand that their biological mothers made bad choices. Your biological mom made a bad choice. She drank when you were in her tummy, and that hurt your brain. And that makes you really sensitive to stress. And it makes you really fearful. And when you get really stressed, you don't trust me anymore to keep you safe. You got to help them understand that about themselves. You're not talking bad about their biological mother. You're telling them the truth. They've got to understand this. Otherwise, they don't know what they're working with. They don't know. How many times have your children said, I don't know why I did that? I don't know why I did that, Mama. I don't know why I keep yelling at you and getting mad and breaking stuff. I don't know, Mama. Well, you got to tell them. It's because your brain is sensitive to stress, and when you get stressed out, bad things happen, and that's why I have to try to help you get regulated. And when you get stressed out and bad things happen, we got to try to do better the next time. Bad things are going to happen, and we have to try to do better the next time. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. So I'm going to give you something real quick. Because we know your children have been stressed out. Even if your children are not here, you get home, your children are stressed out. Because you haven't been there. So the routines change. Right? One of the most important things that a doctor and foster children need, and biological children who've been exposed to trauma, is structure and predictability. Because structure and predictability and consistency help the amygdala stay just a little bit calmer. Here's one of the best things you can do. When you leave here, as you're walking out the door, as soon as you get in your car, you take some deep breaths and you just start breathing. And then when you get home, let your children talk, yada, 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 and they're going to be loud, right? Because you're going to be breathing, you're not going to get stressed out. They're going to be loud, and as you're breathing, you're listening to them, you'll notice they're going to start to calm down just a little bit. Maybe you turn on the music just a little bit, not too much, just a little bit. Check in, make sure they're fed, right? Because making sure your children have food is just a low-level regulatory function. Now, what you're going to do when you go home is I want you to just go sit on the couch. I want you to sit on the couch for 10 to 15 minutes and not do anything. Just sit there. And your children are going to come in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out. And you're just going to sit there and you're just going to chill. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be regulating the environment in your home. you're going to be regulating the environment in the home instead of allowing your child to dysregulate the environment. You're going to take control of the environment in the home. You're going to influence the environment in the home just by breathing on your way home, and when you get home, go sit for 10 to 15 minutes and you go through a transition. Because so many of the challenges you guys deal with are all connected to transitions. Most of your children have early transition trauma. So probably 50% of the behavioral challenges you're dealing with your children are based in transition trauma. You got to learn to influence that transition. Paying attention to it. It's all about the relationship. The relationship becomes the single most important thing, and this is too easy to just brush over. But I want you to understand something. There's either a focus on relationship or there's a focus on behavior. The traditional way we approach children is by focusing on behavior. 95% of every parenting book that you read is going to be focused on behavior. Behavior severs relationships. A behavior focus severs relationships. Because as long as you're focused on behavior, your brain is in a state of stress. You've got to be able to calm your brain, and you've got to focus on relationship. Because as long as you focus on relationship, you have the ability to influence your child. As long as you focus on relationship, you have the ability to influence your child. But if you just keep focusing on behavior, which means you're trying to control, or you're trying to suppress, or you're trying to change, you're just going to be losing more and more relationship. And pretty soon, they're going to find someone else to connect to. When a child does not feel secure in their own home, when they don't feel accepted in their own home, when they don't feel supported in their own home, when they hit adolescence, they're going to start looking for that acceptance and that security. And a lot of times, they're going to find it in other adolescents who didn't feel secure in their own home. So now you got some stressed out, dysregulated adolescents, making one another feel safe and secure and accepted. And what does that look like? That looks like a hot mess, because they're not adults. So then what happens is they develop a stronger relationship to dysfunctional patterns. But in all fairness, some of our own family patterns have been dysfunctional. I grew up in a home of dysfunctional patterns. I grew up in a home of dysfunctional family patterns, and when my sister was 15 years old, she left. She left, and my sister and my parents never got to repair that relationship. They started getting a little bit better. As she got older, things started getting a little bit better. But for that first 15 years, it was dysfunctional. So who she found to hang out with, who she found to be accepted by, they were just as dysfunctional. So she had a rough life. But my parents lost the ability to influence her. When they lost the ability to influence her, she found it somewhere else. And so if you keep focusing on the behaviors and not on the relationship, over time, you will lose. You will lose, and I don't say that to scare you. I just say that because that's the truth. Because they're going to find connection, because that's all your children are looking for, is connection. But we get so stressed out that we constrict into survival. When we constrict into survival, we're not rescuing our children. We're not keeping our kids safe. We lose relationship. We are biologically engineered to be in a relationship. Every dendrite, every cell, every synapse in our brain and body system is engineered for connection and relationship. Relationship is the single most important thing. And sometimes, dadgummit, you don't want to have a relationship. Sometimes you just feel like having a relationship is not enough. Sometimes you feel like just focusing on relationship and not behavior is just letting your kid get away with stuff. You're just letting them get away with it. Well, so what? What if you are? You can't prevent your child from not going to jail when they're an adult. You can't prevent your child from not using drugs. You can do the best you can to create a secure relationship that influences them away from those things. But most of your children have core cellular imprints of alcohol abuse. There's no guarantee. In fact, there's a greater guarantee that they are going to use alcohol when they get older. As soon as they get stressed out and on their own, they're going to look to soothe that. And if they don't have your relationship to fall back on, you can be guaranteed they're going to go to alcohol. It's your relationship and your influence and their feelings about you that's going to be the biggest deterrent from alcohol or drugs and anything else. But if they're stressed out in their relationship with you, you can guarantee they're going to go to something negative. I had kids that were in my group home. I used to have a group home in Virginia Beach with all adolescent boys, treatment homes. I got a kid who's in jail right now. He's 26 now, 27. I met him when he was 15. So he was with us for 3 years till he was 18. We did the best we could. We didn't do restraint, we didn't do medication, we didn't do diagnosis, we didn't do all that stuff. We just created a relationship and love. That kid calls me every week. I'm not his daddy. I'm not his mama. But he calls me every week. From jail. I have more influence over that kid than his parents do. And I only spent 3 years with him. Because I have a relationship with him. And is being in jail like the end of the road? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So when he's out, and he'll be getting out soon, I'll be able to help influence him. And guess what? He might go to jail again. But I'll still be there. I'll still have a relationship with him. I can still influence him. And maybe through that love, one day I can influence him to something good. Maybe he can help someone else. Bruce Lee says one of the best lessons you can learn in life is to master how to remain calm. Steps towards mindfulness. Mindfulness is the ability to slow down and pay attention. You have to slow down. You have to acknowledge the moment. It's like when I said go out to your car and breathe. I'm slowing you down. I'm putting you in the present. Acknowledge the moment. Recognize your current thoughts. Where are your current thoughts? A lot of times they're not on your kids. They're on other things that we as adults are responsible for. Other things that are taking us out of the present. We don't need to worry about those things right now. There's nothing we can do about it. Let's get in the present. Let's just focus. Let's focus on sending loving thoughts and vibrations to our children. I pray for this whole room. I pray for my whole room before I even begin my lecture. The entire room, I just pray over the whole room. I could be thinking about my bills. I could be thinking about my kids. I could be thinking about any number of things. But I'm not. I'm thinking about you guys. Before I even start. You could be thinking about your bills, the dishes, dinner, all that stuff. Or you could be thinking about your child. You could be sending positive vibrations towards them. Say a prayerful message towards them. Speak love over them. But we can't do that if we're not in the present moment. Breathe. Listen without judgment, and then beginning and listen to what your children are saying without judgment. So a lot of times we start judging, we want to defend, we want to rationalize, we want to try to show them that what they're saying doesn't make sense. What they're saying doesn't make sense because they're stressed out. So they can't hear anything you're saying until you calm down, and then help them calm down. Any therapy or technique that is confrontational, aggressive, threatening, blaming, or fear-based will ultimately not be effective for creating healing environments for FASD children. That's for all children. It's not just your children diagnosed with the disorder. How much time we got, Jody?
15 minutes.
All right. So I want you to look at this for a moment. This is going to be a hard one. This is going to be a hard one. On one side we have reactivity, on the other side we have responsibility. We have -1 to -10, all the way up to -100. +1 to +10, all the way up to +100. Over here on the reactivity side, the far extreme is the death penalty. Over on the responsibility side, the far extreme is perfect love. My contention is that the most common things we do with our children fall on the reactivity and fear-based side of the continuum as -1 through 10. Because they only show up as -1 through 10, we don't realize that they sit on the same spectrum as the death penalty. But the two common denominators of all these things are reactivity and fear. The death penalty is the extreme of reactivity and fear. And these are the most common things that we do with kids, not just diagnosed kids, we do them with all kids. But why do we do these things? We do them because they work, right? Because they're probably done to you at some level. When you were in the first grade, it was putting your nose in the corner, right? Or sitting in the naughty chair. Well, that's just another form of timeout. Nothing's changed. We do these things because they work. But here's what you have to understand. These things work with 70% of children. But with the 70%, anything you do will work. With the 70% of children, you can raise an eyebrow and they'll stop doing what they're doing. Because 70% of children have the ability to regulate stress. They have regulated brains. They have a secure window of tolerance. They've got solid ice. So we can do these things and get away with it. But these things don't help with relationships. That's why a lot of family relationships that should be healthy relationships aren't healthy relationships, because we've done this kind of stuff. Even with the 70%. We create a lot of stress and trauma with our biological children who aren't even FASD. And the reason we create the stress and trauma is because we're doing these most common things that we do. Now, what I'm going to tell you is that for the 30%, our FASD kids, our PTSD kids, our reactive attachment disorder children, our bipolar kids, our ADHD kids, our oppositional defiant kids, our conduct disorder kids, that 30%, these things only make it worse. They only make it worse. This is why your children get older and don't get better. And I bet you can go to 9 out of 10 counselors in Calgary, Canada, and all 9 of them are going to give you the same thing. Do timeout, or do behavior modification, or do consequences. And that's just a sad, sad thing. It's a sad, sad thing, because all these things create more stress. And your children's brains have experienced enough stress. Children don't need timeout, they need time in. A child is not acting out for attention. A child is acting out because they need attention. They need your regulation. A child is acting out because they've gone outside of their window of tolerance for how much stress they can handle. I'm going to say that again. Your child is acting out because they've gone outside of their window of tolerance for how much stress they can handle. That means they need you to help turn on their oxytocin response and get them regulated. Isolation, sending a child to their room, doesn't help you develop their regulatory system. It doesn't help you turn on their oxytocin. It can help them calm down. Sometimes we all need a little time alone. That's okay. But sending a child to their room when they're stressed out is not helping. It's not helping develop their regulatory system because they're stressed out and they're acting out because they've gone outside of their window of tolerance. Spanking. Don't spank. Just don't. Just don't. Every time you hit your child, you create an imprint right along with all the other trauma they've experienced in their life. You become just like everyone else every time you hit. Every time you hit. And I know sometimes you just get so freaking frustrated. My dad used to whip my butt when I was a kid. I've got every cellular imprint in my being to whip my children. But I don't. I don't. I've got a 24-year-old, a 15-year-old, and I've got a 26-year-old adopted son. Last time I hit my child, my 24-year-old, was when she was 2 years old. I don't think I'd ever even hit her up until then. She peed in the middle of the floor. She was walking around stressed. I was stressed. Her mom was stressed. She heard us bigger. She just started peeing. She was walking around naked. She's 18 months old, peeing. And I was stressed because I was bigger than their mom. So then I got stressed at her. Swatted her on the potty. I said, "You don't pee on the floor. You pee in the potty." And I picked her up, took her to the bathroom, stood there. I said, "Pee goes in the potty." Standing in the bathroom, and all of a sudden, this big old tear welled up in her big old brown eye, and it just crested her big cheek. One tear that started rolling down her face, and I melted. And I got down on my knees in front of her, and I said, "Honey, I'm so sorry. Daddy will never hit you again." And I didn't. I didn't know what else I was going to do. But I knew I wasn't going to hit. Because I don't want my kids to be afraid of me. I don't want my kids to love me. And there is no respect in fear. There's no respect in fear. There's only fear. I want my children to love me and feel loved by me. Don't have consequences. Talked about that for a little bit. I believe that you got to give the children consequences to teach them responsibility. It's not true. Number one, if the child is misbehaving, they're not thinking clearly anyway. If they're not thinking clearly, their short-term memory's not open. You give them a consequence, guess what? They didn't learn a thing. Guess who becomes a threat when you give a child a consequence? You do. You become the threat when you give a child a consequence. Have you ever given your child a consequence and they said to you, "Oh, I'm so sorry I did that, Mom and Dad"? No, they say, "Screw you." Because you become the threat. See, a lot of times we take away all these things over here on this negative side. We take away the opportunity to help our children develop internal regulation, internal mechanisms of control, because we become the threats. When you become the threat, you take away the opportunity for your child to learn. So you can take your child to the grocery store and you can say, "Hey, you're going to get in the basket, you little thief. That's your consequence. Can't take you anywhere. You get in the basket." That doesn't feel very good. Or you can take your child to the grocery store, you can pull up and say, "Honey, you know what? When we come to the grocery store, it's stressful. I get stressed, you get stressed, and when you get stressed, you take things that don't belong to you." And so in order to help you feel safe, I'm going to help you get in the basket. Because when I put you in the basket, I can contain the space. You don't feel so threatened. And then you won't put things in your pockets that don't belong to you. You won't get stressed. I won't get stressed. We'll get in here, we'll get out. Now, I know you're 14 years old. Brian said, contain the space. Keep them with you. When you contain the space, you reduce the threats. Creating a therapeutic environment. Number one is mindfulness. Number two is understanding. I want you guys to understand the dynamic of fear and understand the dynamic of stress. I want you to focus on that more than you focus on anything else. You want your children to learn effectively, you've got to get your children regulated. If your children are stressed out, and you've got stress-sensitive children. If your children are stressed, they cannot learn. Their learning impairments and their learning challenges are coming because they're so easily overwhelmed. Yes, they were exposed to alcohol in utero. Yes, that affects parts of their brain. But it just makes them more sensitive. You have to manage that stress. Manage their stress, and that's how you help them to be able to regulate it. Nutrition, so important. You can't take a child who's hyperactive and can't focus and feed them sugar all the time. Not unnatural sugars, processed foods. We do those things because it's easy and we have a lot of those same habits, but that's affecting your children's brains. There's natural food and there's unnatural foods. Natural foods like fruits, vegetables, those things have sugar in them too, but they're natural sugars that your body can process. The reason unnatural processed foods affect your child's brain is because your body can't process it. So it builds up what's called homeocysteine in the gut. And when it builds up homeocysteine in the gut, it actually creates inflammation. So they can't focus. They can't sit still. They don't feel good. All they want to do is lay around because their body can't process that stuff. So you have to watch the things that you feed them because it matters. And I know sometimes it's just easy. And sometimes you just do it because it's easy. But honor that. But other times, make better choices. Awareness, affection, and attunement. When we get stressed out, the first thing we do is we stop having affection with our children. Your children need at least 3 hugs a day. At least 3 hugs a day. Even if you don't like them, just squeeze them hard. Right? 3 hugs. Becoming aware of the space that they're in, what they're feeling. Attunement is listening, being connected to your children. If you don't feel connected to your child, it's because you're misattuned. You got to feel connected, and you get misattuned because you get stressed. Time in. Instead of doing time out, bring the child into you. Say, we're going to hang out for a little bit, because I can tell you're stressed, I'm stressed, so I just need you to hang out over here with me for a little bit. And when you feel better, you can go back and play. But right now, you just need to hang out. You see, I said when you feel better, because a lot of times when a child's hanging out with you, they actually do feel better, and they don't want to go back and play. And pretty soon, you're like, go play. Goodness gracious. Containing emotional and environmental. Your children are being real emotional. You have to contain them. You have to contain them with your emotions. It's called creating a holding environment. I've got you. You're mad, I'm right here, I've got you, I can contain you, I can help you feel safe. And then containment of the physical environment, which is oftentimes reducing the space that your child has to move all around in. 10-20-10, as long as your child is not at risk of harming themselves, that was 3-phase intervention. 10-20-10, it's very simple. If you do this for 2 weeks consistently, I'll guarantee you a 50% reduction in your child's most severe behavior, if not a complete elimination. 50% just by doing this one thing. 10 minutes of quality time and attention first thing in the morning. Before they ever go get out of bed. Go soothe them, go rub their back, go rub their hair, go sing them a song, feed them a bottle, whatever. 10 minutes before they get out of bed. 20 minutes as soon as they get home. One-on-one time. Listen, now if you got 10 kids, you got to do 1-2-1. Right? But this is the child who's got the most severe behaviors. 20 minutes in the afternoon as soon as they get home, or as soon as you get home from work. 20 minutes one-on-one. And then 10 minutes in the evening. 10-20-10. Do that for 2 weeks. 2 weeks consistently, every day. Every day. You will be amazed at what happens to your child's most severe behavior. We talked about 3-phase intervention, setting effective limits. We're not always good at that. We're not always good at setting effective limits. We set a limit, our kid asks, can I? No. Can I? No. Can I? Can I? Can I? Yes, I guess so. We set the precedent. We set a precedent in their brain for them to want to keep asking, because they know if they keep asking, they'll eventually get to it. That's our, you know why we as parents can't set effective limits? One reason. Parental guilt. We feel guilty. And then we cave. And then we get mad because our children won't accept the limits that we set. Well, we keep giving them every opportunity not to. No means no. It's okay to be the bad guy. Your child doesn't have to like you. I just assume you not like me. If you're my kid, you ain't gonna like me at all. That makes my job easy, because you know no means no. But what happens is you do respect me, because I'm predictable. Because you know whatever I say is what I say. I don't leave a lot of guesswork. We have a real difficult time with that. I got a parenting camp coming up August 16th and 17th. You can check that out at postparentingcamp.com. It's going to be a really intense emotional experience. Rumi, one of my favorite poets, says the wound is the place where the light enters you. We're oftentimes so afraid of our children's negative behaviors, but their negative behaviors is where the healing opportunity is at. When they're in their negative behaviors, that's when you've got the greatest opportunity to go in and rescue them. But you got to ask yourself, where am I showing up? How am I showing up? When my child is in the midst of their stuff, where am I going? Am I going in to rescue them and pull them out of that muck, or am I letting them drown? You guys can follow me at Post+Institute on Facebook 5 days a week. I do a daily show. I didn't do it today. This has been the show. It's called Post Daily Dose. Every day, 5 days a week, I'll do a show. I've done 225 episodes. You can go on our Facebook page, and there's 225 videos that I've done on every different topic. And I do them every single day, 5 days a week. On Instagram, I don't post as much on Instagram, and there's a ton of videos on YouTube at Post+Institute. God bless you guys. I know it's not easy, but you can do it. You're great parents. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. Just don't give up. Even when you think it's the darkest time. Just take some deep breaths. Sleep on it. Take a step back. Take a day off. Leave your kids at school one day. Teachers call, say I'm not coming. Need a meeting. You got to take care of yourself, because working and raising these children is not easy. It's challenging. It's stressful. So you have to take care of yourself, because if you're not taking care of yourself, you can't take care of your kids. God bless you, and thank you for coming out.